and welcome to An Evening with Nirvana, a podcast where I talk to a variety of guests from the Doom community about level design, map creation, and other facets of game development. Today on the podcast, I'm talking to American McGee. He's a level designer for Ultimate Doom, Doom 2, level and sound designer for Quake and Quake 2, and creator of the extremely popular Alice series of games. He's also a designer of a unique range of plushies, and we'll get into those later. Welcome to the show, American. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me, and I am doing quite all right, other than I'm suffering a little bit of a sore throat, so if I sound funny, that's why.
That's okay. I have like a naturally kind of scratchy voice anyway, so I think people are used to it if they listen to the show at all.
All right, well, they'll just assume we're both heavy smokers or something.
Yeah. I used to smoke actually, but I managed to quit about 10 years ago.
That's good. Same here.
Nice. Co-quitters. I like it. I suppose I'll start out with a fairly basic question. I usually ask people, how did you get into Doom at this point? But obviously that's a bit of a different thing for you. I'm curious, like, what were the earliest sort of video games you remember that interested you?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a very long time ago, right? So
Yeah.
when I first started playing games, we're still back in sort of the mid 80s. And I remember playing on game systems like the Odyssey, um, which, I can't even remember what the games there were, but there were sort of these rudimentary, space flight games and sports games and Pong type games, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I got into messing around with, the Apple IIe, the Commodore 64, the Amiga, and that kind of progressed. And throughout all of that, I played a whole variety of whatever games I could get my hands on. But I don't remember anything really sort of sticking out to me until I stumbled on Wolfenstein. And by that time, I was maybe 18, 19 years old, and I was working as a mechanic in a car shop, and I was helping them to set up a PC in their office to take care of accounting and parts ordering and things like that. And I remember going to like a swap meet for computer parts, and there was a shareware copy of Wolfenstein there. And I remember when I popped that in, something clicked in my brain that was like, this is going to change the world. This is so
Mm-hmm.
radically different from everything that's come before, everything I've played before. And little did I know, of course, that I would somehow magically end up, having my life intersect directly with the guys who were making those games.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I know you've told the story before, but it is like quite a unique way that you got involved with id. Could you just very briefly talk about how that happened?
If I had $1 for every time I had to tell this story.
Yeah, I'm sorry to even
Um,
ask, but
okay. So, yeah, I mean, the short and simple version of it is that I was a high school dropout. I was working as a car mechanic, and that I ended up living in the same apartment complex as John Carmack. And so I would come home, covered in grease, and he would come home driving in a Ferrari. But we ended up, we met, and then we started playing games together. And at some point, he invited me and some other people up to the id office to start testing on a new game they were making, which was Doom. And I managed to, I don't know, impress him or something, to the point where one day he took me aside and asked if I would like to have a full-time job working at id.
Mhm.
At the moment where he did it, I wasn't even thinking that that was a possibility. I was too in awe of the thing. It's sort of like being invited up to Mount Olympus by the gods themselves, and then one day one of them takes you aside and is like, "Hey, would you like to come work up here too?" Right? Um, so yeah, I mean, it was a shock, but of course I said yes. And I started off doing tech support. So I was answering the phones for people who were having problems with, the existing games that it had launched. And then I spent my time, while I was answering phones, tinkering around inside of the level editor, and with the other tools that were in the office for building games. And I quickly got to be proficient with level design, such that when id, naturally decided that the amount of tech support calls coming in could not be handled by myself and Sean Green in office, That work was outsourced, but he and I had managed to, train ourselves sufficiently to not be made redundant. So I got moved into working on level design work, and he got moved into working on tech programming work.
Interesting. I guess that's sort of how the games industry was back then a little bit. Just discovering what talents people had and then putting them to work in those areas rather than, looking at resumes and seeing they'd done studying and, all this stuff.
Yeah, I don't know what it's like trying to get into the industry these days, but I know that when I was hiring people for Spicy Horse, I oftentimes cared more about their portfolio in terms of the work I could see and that I could touch and that I could play. I cared more about that than I did, where they went to school. So I've always maintained that, it's better to look at the person's output or even to look at the person's potential versus looking at their degrees or whatever sort of paper they have with them.
Yeah. I mean, I think when it comes to something that's a creative endeavor, I feel like often that is the more important aspect. Hold on, I'm just getting a little bit of background noise. I'll just fix it for a sec. Okay, should be all good. Yeah, I suppose it's interesting to me, you and Carmack sort of becoming friends over the course of this, and him seeing something in you. He sort of seemed to surround himself with these sort of very creative people, and obviously he's very creative in terms of programming, but maybe I sort of see the two of you as being a little oppositional in terms of like the kinds of things you would want to do, like gameplay wise and things like that. Maybe that's incorrect to say, but that's the sense that I get.
Yeah, well, I think that there's something to that. And I think that there's something to people being attracted to their opposites.
Mm-hmm.
And for sure, I mean, where, John would be considered technically, an expert, there would be some that would say that, my domain might be more on the creative side, on the writing side, And so I think it was a good mix. The same is true with John Romero and John Carmack. The two personalities probably couldn't be more opposing, even more so than you could say with mine and Carmack's personalities.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there was something to it that made it work very well, that partnership. And I think that that's often important. That, we're not very good as human beings producing where there's a lack of pressure, and oftentimes where there's a lack of friction. That's important for us to be challenged, to have people question what it is we're doing, and to push back, because it's often when someone's pushing back against us or how we would normally do something, that it forces us to think about the solutions to that problem in a different way. Mm-hmm. And I saw that a lot with John Carmack, and I think he was right, and he was very smart in surrounding himself with people who provided, not an easy environment. Like, he could have surrounded himself with a bunch of other Carmacks, but I don't think that the result of that would have been anywhere near as interesting, and I think he's aware of that as well.
Yeah, and when I talked to Sandy Peterson, he actually said that one thing he always noted about, or admired, I suppose, about John Carmack was that he would always be like very willing to admit when he was wrong about something. So like, even if he was sort of leading projects in a lot of ways, like if somebody made him realize in that moment that he was incorrect, he would instantly be willing to sort of flip his position, which sounds like, a beneficial thing to have as someone leading those types of projects.
Yeah, I think so. But I think you could also certainly find instances where he, like anyone else, could be stubborn, sort of to a fault on certain issues. So,
mm-hmm.
But I do think that the thing maybe that Sandy's saying is that John could go both ways, and I think it's important to be able to go both ways. You need to be able to recognize when you're wrong and admit it, but you also need to be stubborn at those moments where you know that the path you're pursuing is the right one. It's in finding the balance and choosing one or the other at the right time that makes a good leader or a good partner, to work with.
Hmm. And when sort of production with Doom 2 started, do you remember sort of what like the sort of original goals were for the game, like compared to what they were doing with Doom 1? Do you remember sort of what the concept building was like for level design and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is probably again one of those questions that's better for someone like Romero or someone like Sandy to answer. But what I recall was a very simple situation where we had a room where the artists were sat. That was Kevin and Adrian, and they would produce texture sets for us as individual level designers.
Mm-hmm.
And those texture sets, um, I think they were kind of a product of what we were asking for and also what we were producing. So there was sort of a synergistic back and forth that, wow, American seems to make really good levels around this theme of stone and iron and lava. So let's give him more stone and iron and lava that suits his style.
Yeah.
Where Sandy was making much more surrealistic and colorful levels, and John was making things that were much more heavily themed towards, sort of Gothic castle architecture and stuff like that. So the sort of design or production methodology really seemed to kind of focus around, um, what are these guys, what are they excelling at, in terms of the type of production or content that they're making. What was your question about Doom 2 or about Quake? Sorry.
It was about Doom 2, but I think all of what you said
Oh,
is applicable
well,
regardless, I think.
yeah, I think to some degree, and I think that carried over quite a bit, but it definitely carried over into the way that Quake was getting made as well.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's true that in Doom 2, it was a sort of similar thing. I remember working with a lot of these textures that the other designers didn't work with as much, and then also, there were whole texture sets that John kind of worked in mainly, and Sandy didn't touch as much, and so forth and so on, like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to hear about it, because I think everyone thinks of the id team as being all these singularly talented people together, and that's where all of the like positive aspects of the game comes from. But it sounds like it's also down to maybe a production method that lended itself to promoting each individual person's like strengths as well.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think that, any of that was done by design. I think it was
Uh-huh.
primarily by convenience. It was primarily because it was what worked. You're talking a language that didn't even exist back in that era of,
Mm.
synergistic, holistic, everybody working together,
Yeah, yeah.
team. No, it like you have to also keep in mind that the guys sitting in that art room, Kevin and Adrian, they never came out of there, and it was like this weird. The lights were always off. It was kind of closed off. The doors were always closed. You kind of felt like you were going into another realm within the office every time you went in there. So, at least from my perspective, to suggest that there was an intentional managerial thought process that went towards trying to improve results by applying some sort of methodology, no, I don't
I
think that
gotcha.
was. I don't think that was happening, at all. I think it was more kind of seat of the pants combined with what seems to be working, and don't mess with it if it's working.
Sure, yeah. And as somebody who didn't come, I guess, from like a quote unquote schooled level design background, how did you sort of go about building up a process for making maps?
So I bought a bunch of books on traditional or sort of classic architecture, from the Roman era, and then also from modern day architects. I often mention when we do these interviews, there's a Japanese architect called Tadao Ando, who does sort of works in concrete a lot. And if you go look up the designs of his buildings, you'll see why, if you're a Doom or a Quake level designer, like why that guy's work would speak to you.
Right.
There's a kind of like a utilitarian functionality combined with a playing with light to create an artistic space. So it's a space that's got a soul and a feeling to it.
Mm-hmm.
So he's really good at that, and I took a lot of inspiration from him, and then I combined it with this bunch of reference drawings and whatnot from eras of traditional or classic architecture, and that was kind of where I got my my ideas from, where I got my foundation from, and then I would kind of riff on top of that.
Right. And this is one of those questions where you're probably going to be like, I do not remember it all, but out of the maps that you made for Doom 2, do you remember there being one that was like particularly enjoyable to work on, or one that you felt stood out as being sort of particularly impressive?
I yeah, it's just too long ago. I don't know.
Yeah, that's totally fair.
Are you?
I mean, it's funny.
I often see other people online they'll go on and on about, oh, you're the guy that made M4, I don't know, and so I just don't know anymore.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair.
Yeah.
I mean, I will ask people questions from the community who, they didn't work on the original Doom, but they themselves have been making stuff for so long that even they are forgetting like what they made, because
Sure.
This game's like 10.
I mean, there's
20 years.
There's some of them that are iconic because everybody talks about them, like the one that had the big crusher element in it, which I think that was actually the name of the map, was actually the Crusher.
Yep.
So I mean, I remember making that map, and I remember that when I made maps, I used to do a lot of experimentation. I would experiment with enemy placement and barrel placement and physical things that could crush the enemies or the player. And I loved lava because there was sort of a multifunction aspect of light and damage to it. And it's funny because there was a lot of work done for me, and I think the other level designers, of experimentation that, of course, the general public never laid eyes on. But I really liked messing around in the engine just to kind of see what could be done. And there's a lot of stuff that would just break the engine, obviously. So by the time anything made it into the game, you always had to make sure that it wasn't going to break the game. But in terms of like looking back, if you ask me what my favorite ever map was that I made while working at id, and about the process of it, for sure, my favorite result and also my favorite process was DM4, which was a Quake deathmatch map. And that's because I built it in a day, and also it was one of the most fun things to play deathmatch in. So I was always very proud of that, and I got the sense that a lot of other people liked that one as well. So that would be high on the list.
I guess because I think you did some beta testing for the original Doom. Was it kind of weird coming back? Because I mean, you did Doom 2, and then you came back to do Ultimate Doom as well. Was it strange coming back into that game as someone who didn't build levels for it originally, and then adding on this extra episode?
Well, look, the whole experience was weird.
Yeah.
Again, being invited, like I said, the analogy of, hey kid, come up here and work with us on Mount Olympus. There were whole periods of time I would just go into work and couldn't even believe that I was there, or that any of it was real. Much less that yeah, wow, I liked that Doom game, and now I'm getting to work on that Doom game, and now we're going to go back and do level packs for the Doom game. And yeah, I mean, it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing.
And I guess that fourth episode is like pretty challenging comparatively to the rest of the game, and your opening map for it, which you most likely don't even remember at this point, but It is it's quite a challenging opening map. I guess like with the birth of like the Souls like genre and things like that, bringing difficulty back into the forefront of design, I feel like these days. Do you have like particular preferences or thoughts about difficulty in games?
Well, so I know that I've had people I've had people tweet at me things along the lines of, E4M1, damn you, or go to hell, or, how dare you. So I know the legend of this map, and I know that people think it's funny to, sort of berate me for it being so difficult. But I do recall that when we got around to making this as an add-on pack, there was some discussion that, like, let's just go all out. Let's just make this kind of crazy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we did. And of course, for us playing internally, we'd sit there all day over and over and over playing these things, and we got to be pretty good. So, if something was difficult for us, it meant it was going to be really difficult for your average player.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a map like this would be the typical result. But going forward, as I went off to make my own games, and when we do I'll live stream playing like Alice Madness Returns, and I'm sitting there cursing myself for some of the sections that are too difficult. And I actually believe that in general, the games industry has a sort of gatekeeping problem of making games that are difficult for the kind of average non-gamer to get into, and not just because, like, the level kills you quickly or there's some really mean traps that you've set up, but just the expectation of the basic knowledge that a person has to have in order to get into gaming these days on a modern console. And I think that no matter how much a game tries to get someone into a tutorial, and understanding the control scheme, I mean, a lot of times these control schemes end up being like you're playing a frickin' saxophone, just to get your guy to move through the game space and stay alive.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think for my games, when I'm setting out and trying to say to people how we're going to build these things, I'd like to build AAA looking, super awesome story, really compelling games, but that basically play very casually. And to further that, I've even had the thought at times that we might get to a point where the characters that we are driving inside of these games take on, a sort of AI awareness of their own, so that you could have a mode in which if you try to push a character off a cliff or into a situation they're not prepared for, they could turn around, face the camera, and be like, "I'm not doing that yet. I'm not ready for that." Or, "Don't. What are you trying to get me killed?" And so that's how far I would push it. I would push it to like a casual game where you're sort of partnered up with the character on screen, and that character wants you to be better so you don't repeatedly murder them, right?
Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming this kind of mentality ends up influencing like your testing process for games as well. Do you tend to have these sort of ideas about difficulty like be heavily enforced when you do testing and stuff?
Well, yeah, but the problem, if you want to call it a problem, is that game development is a team effort. It's a collaboration. And so if you look at, say, for example, Alice Madness Returns, there were a lot of different voices on that team, some of whom didn't want for the game to be overly casual. They wanted there to be some fair degree of difficulty in there. And so a lot of times you end up in a place where you're making compromises. And that's certainly where we ended up on the original Alice game and where we ended up on Madness Returns. I don't take an approach of like, I'm the ultimate dictator of everything that's going to be in this game when we're doing games. And that extends to this question of like, if you did give me that ultimate control, I would definitely push to make the games super casual. In terms of difficulty level. But I always set out from the start when we're building these things to tell the team that it's a group effort and everybody's got a voice. And if I get voted down on difficulty level, then I get voted down, and I have to be consistent.
Yeah, of course. Um, just to go back, I suppose, to Quake. I think when I talked to Sandy, he sort of talked about how Quake and Doom were being developed simultaneously and how that made things kind of difficult. What was the transitional period for you like between working on those two games?
Well, it wasn't difficult for me because I got pulled off of Doom and I got put almost exclusively to work on Quake.
Uh-huh.
So I was John's testing assistant, or I don't know how you'd call it, but basically he was building the tools and the technology for Quake, and I was sitting there day in, day out, working inside of the tools to build stuff and then give him feedback, and build stuff and give him feedback. And then I also started to pick up some of the development tools to start working alongside him on scripting and editor stuff, and so that I wasn't I wasn't bothered by it because I was the first one to transition over to working on what became Quake and the
Mhm.
tools that made Quake what it is.
And you sort of had a multi sort of purpose role, I guess, doing like level design and sound design and tools and things like that. How how did you manage to sort of balance all those different roles? Was this
Well,
a
obviously
CD
I
and pants
didn't,
kind of
'cause,
thing?
I mean, ultimately I got fired.
Oh, right.
So clearly,
Well,
clearly I wasn't balancing those roles very well. I don't know. Um, I mean, yeah, at the time I was having a blast. I loved it. I was wearing a bunch of different hats, and
mm,
I was having a lot of fun. But I think I was also heading towards some degree of burnout, and
yeah.
I was getting a little bit too wild in my extracurricular activities away from work. Um, so, but yeah, there was a period of time there that was really fun. I was working with the Nine Inch Nails and the Marilyn Manson guys in New Orleans. I'd go down there and do sound and music sessions with them, and then bring that content back to Dallas and drop all that in the game and write the scripting to get the sounds working with the weapons, and then putting that into the levels, and doing sound effect editing and creation, and it was a blast. I was having a lot of fun.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, that to me, I think that was the pinnacle, kind of the height of my having sort of fingers in lots of different pieces of making one game, and it was great.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a lot to take on, but also, yeah, it does sound like maybe uh, you did like it sounds like you did a lot of learning during that period in terms of game design that you would probably utilize a lot later on. So beneficial in the end.
Well, yeah, I think in terms of game production, and everything that goes into production, it was incredibly beneficial because I got to have a glimpse of many of the different skill sets or stacks that make a development go forward. So that was good.
Mhm. And in terms of sort of like the overarching elements of Quake and I guess games it did in general, uh, did the team generally tend to figure these things out together, like, or was it usually left to people like Carmack and Romero?
To figure out what exactly.
I guess like like the thematic elements of a game, or I guess there wasn't
Um,
much story, but the sort of more overarching elements.
yeah, I never really understood where that came from. And I've said this in previous interviews. Theoretically, or supposedly, there were some meetings where we sat down, and I seem to vaguely remember like one or two design-focused meetings where there was this discussion of like, all right, we're making Doom 2, or we're going to make Quake 2, and this is the general outline of it. But it often felt like, for me, just kind of sitting there making maps, none of that mattered because, again, I was just being handed texture sets that I was comfortable working with and told to make a thing that had a beginning, middle, and end as a level. And I think I kind of understood that later on that would all be stitched together into something, but that wasn't my job. My job wasn't to stitch it all together. My job was to create map content, and that's kind of what I was doing. it's different when you're building a game where the narrative arc for a particular level is like the door opens, you shoot your gun a lot, you kill a lot of monsters, you traverse some geography, you get to the end point, the level ends. I mean, it's not like there's a checkpoint in there where, oh, this is, chapter 3, it's that scene where the space marine talks to this guy. No, there was nothing like that. So again, I mean, a lot of times I hear people asking these questions, but these questions feel like they would be more appropriate for an era of development that hadn't really started yet.
Sure,
and so it was just kind of, we built it and then we tacked it all together and we shipped it.
And what do you think? Maybe partially, like, obviously tensions were quite high during that period and everything, and whatever happened, but was there also maybe a sense for you that you wanted to move into producing your own games?
No. Again, everything to me was like this surreal dream where, similar to, I couldn't have imagined that I could even get a job there, so I wouldn't even have dreamt it, much less asked somebody, can I get a job here?
Sure.
Once I was in the door, I mean, I don't know how to describe the feeling. It's not confusion, but it's a sort of, you don't want to say or do anything to make people aware that maybe you shouldn't even be there.
So being an adult.
You don't even bring up or like rock the boat. Maybe. I don't know. So I just, once I was there, I kind of had it in my mind that like, maybe I'll just work here for the rest of my life. I don't know, because I couldn't imagine that there could be possibly anything beyond this. What could be better? And so I wasn't at all thinking like anything about, oh, I want to make my own games, or, is there life after id? I didn't have any sort of thoughts like that at all.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, remember also, I was only 23 years old.
Yeah.
What was I supposed to, yeah.
Yeah, definitely a weird, surreal thing. But also maybe how everyone is in adulthood anyway.
Yeah.
Just be there, pretend you know what's going on, figure things out as you go kind of thing.
Yeah.
So how did, I guess, like, moving on to Alice, how did it feel moving from, I guess, creating levels for games that were entirely focused on gameplay and, like you said, very limited story-wise, to, I guess, like, crafting a richer narrative?
Well, I was fortunate to team up with the guys that had been down the hall from id, working on using the technology to build games that were better put together, that did have story and that did have, proper story arcs and character arcs and things like that. That was the guys at Rogue Entertainment. And they had already been doing narrative-driven games inside of the Doom engine, while we at id were doing just action games inside of the Doom engine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when it came time, that the opportunity was handed to me to go make my own game, a lot of the pieces kind of just fell into place where, the notion of Alice in Wonderland came up, and then, this kind of dark gothic art style, and then I had some ideas with R.J. Berg about, the story and how that might relate to my personal narrative, like my experiences in life. And then as we were thinking about developers, the top of the list were my friends at Rogue. And I knew that they had the experience with the technology plus the experience with crafting story-driven games that would make this thing shine. And so all those pieces came together. And of course, it was a much different way of developing. And I had to learn a lot. I learned a lot from RJ. That was my production partner at EA, and he was the writer on, on the first and second Alice games. And he taught me, all about how to organize the thoughts and the goals for the story around a script and how to build that into the planning for the game. And of course, the Rogue guys drove a lot of that as well, because they understood what was required if you've got a story and how you want to break that down into being a game. And so again, it all goes back to collaboration and a team effort. And we were really lucky to have people like RJ and people at Rogue like Rich and like Jim, who they knew this stuff already. Right. And so yeah, it just worked out really well.
So did the like design process for this game begin with story then, and then the story elements sparked gameplay concepts, or did that all sort of happen fairly simultaneously?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing that was a big difference between how, say, the Doom era that I worked in functioned and how we did this one, where on the Doom stuff, it was make the levels and then slap the story on at the end. And with Alice, it was we did the story and art and the characters and all this stuff first, and then we started talking about how to make the levels and how to build the game around that, right? So yeah, it was a very different process.
And I guess we talked a little bit about getting traumatic experiences out and finding ways to sort of deal with them externally. And I guess Alice is obviously a game sort of centered around grappling with psychological demons in like a tangible way. Was that sort of because I guess you've talked about how you built that process of dealing with that sort of those traumatic experiences and memories and things over the course of your life. Was this early beginnings of dealing with that, or were you already was this just part of that process?
Well, I had already been doing some of that kind of work, and thinking about creation, the creative process as a way of working through, whether you want to call it like a childhood traumas or whatever, but working through your issues.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, this was the first time I was able to sit down and sort of apply that. Prior to Alice, I actually spent some time working with the author Michael Crichton on another game that ultimately was published by Eidos, but it meant that I got to spend a lot of time talking with him and traveling with him on his sort of creative process and how he did this sort of stuff. And that also helped to kind of get it in my head that, what I really want to be is like this guy, because this guy, he's the creator of ER, the TV show, and Jurassic Park, the movie series, and he's making games and he's making all. And I really admired him for his, creative output, his creative ability. And it was just all over the place where he was able to create. And I really liked that. So I think that was one of the bigger inspirations after id for me to say, okay, well, I'm not going to, I'm not at id anymore, obviously, but what do I want to be? Who do I want to be? And I just remember meeting him and spending time with him was very, I think, transformative for me, to see a person living that kind of life and that I looked up to and thought, hey, this is really cool. This is something like, this is cooler than anything I've messed with in the past, even, Hollywood and all this stuff. So that had a big impact on me.
And I guess moving on to Spicy Horse, reading about the founding of that company, I found it interesting that you found that a lot of people in China are sort of working as outsourced talent for Western companies. And from what I can gather, you sort of wanted to utilize that talent for, making original games. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit just about the experience of moving over to China and making use of that talent.
Yeah, well, the China stuff happened, I don't know, a little bit almost accidentally. But I originally went to Hong Kong at the request of a publisher there who had funded the development of a game called Bad Day LA. And that's a whole podcast and a whole story in itself. But the move to Hong Kong was one thing, and I kind of had my eyes on that I was being very narrow in my vision because, what I didn't realize is Hong Kong is right on the doorstep of mainland China. And that when I first started traveling into mainland China, I was shocked. I was like, wow, this is wild. Just the pace of everything and the people and the talent, and then nobody in the world was talking about it except when I got to Shanghai. I realized, like, oh, IDOS is here, EA is here, Sony is here,
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft is here. All these companies are here, and they all have these huge outsource production companies, hundreds, sometimes thousands of employees that are building the assets that go into all the products that we play as games or use as software or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And I started meeting people who were working in these big teams, and I found that a lot of them had their own dreams and desires to work on games where they were higher up and had a, more creative input into what was getting made, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that sort of kicked off this idea in my mind that there was something interesting that could be done in China, and that happened to line up magically with an offer from GameTap, the company, with them calling up and saying, "Hey, we want you to make a game for us." And I said, "Well, if I'm going to do that, is it okay if I do it by building a new studio in China?" And I thought they were going to say no, right? Which would have been the sensible
Right.
thing. And they came back and they're like, "Yeah, sure, no problem, go for it." And I was shocked. I just thought, like,
Mm-hmm.
really, you're going to send me like $3 million, to just build a whole company over here in China? And all right. So anyway, we did, and that was the start of Spicy Horse. And from the start, it just went great. It was just awesome. We got great people. They did amazing work, and all of sort of my vision or dream for what I thought we could accomplish here. It all worked out, and yeah, it was just a lot of fun. It's probably one of the proudest things that I've ever done in my life.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, reading about it, I just thought it was. I guess I thought it was particularly unique because I suppose reading that they had all these people who were working as sort of outsourced talent for these big companies and things. It kind of fits into that. I don't know, the structure of the West utilizing China as a factory for its products, but then a lot of that talent seems to like not come through. Like you were saying, there are people with dreams of their own and like things that they want to be creative with over there. And I just thought it was very interesting to be able to hear that kind of other side of it for once.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship that the U.S. has with China, one of the things, why I originally even left the U.S. and moved to Hong Kong, because I was really disgusted with U.S. foreign policy and how the U.S. was waging these endless wars in the Middle East and murdering
Mm-hmm.
all these innocent people, and that my tax dollars were going to do that, right? So when I moved to Hong Kong and then to China, I naively thought, oh, this is a place where that sort of blowback and that sort of issue of U.S. interference in foreign affairs won't come to bother me.
Right.
You look
Yeah.
at the situation today, and it's really incredible to me because I guarantee you will get people who write comments down below this podcast once you post it up,
Mm-hmm.
who will be accusing me of being a CCP shill or on the payroll of Xi Jinping or all kinds of, or the other one they love to say is I'm going to get social credit points for saying positive things about
Right.
China.
Right. Yeah.
But what's really incredible to me about all these people and all this animosity that's being generated in the West towards China is the lack of awareness of how totally intertwined these two countries are. That the U.S. cannot function without the exports from China that
Yeah.
that undergird everything. The parts that go into your cars, and obviously all the electronics that fill up your house, and the clothing that you wear on your back, and it's so much stuff that's produced in China. And there are, I think, 70,000 American companies registered for business here in China, and of course all the big names that everyone knows. And the Chinese don't have this sort of antagonistic view towards Americans, the U.S., or the rest of the world that seems to be in the DNA of Americans to look
Mm-hmm.
everywhere they look. They need to find that there's competition, there's a threat, there's an antagonist. It's sort of like Americans have it in their mind that everything in the world needs to fit neatly within the script or the narrative outline of like a Top Gun movie, right?
Yeah, yeah.
America is good, and these bad guys over here are bad, and we got to blow them up a little bit to get them some freedom or something, right?
Mm.
And it's just not how the rest of the world operates. And then when you spend some time living outside of the U.S., as I've done, you find that it's really a bizarre worldview that Americans have, this antagonism towards other nations and other people, because it's very one-sided. That when you go around the world, you do not find other people operate under this sort of system.
Right.
This is uniquely American. But anyway, I digress. I just, yeah, I'll go through the comments of this later and laugh at the people who say that stuff.
It, yeah. Well, I mean, I know it was a digression, but happy to continue it really, because I do wonder that point you made about, how much, of the exports of China helps the US out, and how they basically couldn't function without them. And I do wonder if a lot of the antagonism actually comes from some level of awareness that the US can't function without other countries. And that perhaps that is angering certain people for whatever reason.
Well, I think that in the US, you have a lot of cognitive dissonance that exists on a subconscious level, where people are told on the one hand that this is the shining, beacon on the hill. It's the land of freedom and opportunity. And yet, at any moment, if you look at the global landscape, you will see that American weapons and American politics are driving death and destruction in multiple countries around the world, that innocent people are suffering constantly because of American foreign policy, that America encircles half of the globe in, 800 plus military bases, while at the same time screaming at the top of their lungs about the military planning and aggression of foreign nations who have no foreign military bases anywhere in the world, right?
Right.
I feel like for a lot of the people who get really bent out of shape about this, that anger stems from the fact that they know deep down inside that these things I just said are totally at odds with one another. You cannot be this, peace-loving, democracy-spreading, rule of law abiding nation, while at the same time acting like a total rogue asshole and blowing up other people's property and killing people's families and breaking all the rules that you claim are so sacrosanct, right? I just tweeted the other day, there was an article about a series of islands called Chagos, which is over in the Indian Ocean. And it popped up because there was an article talking about how the people living on this island chain there were forcibly evicted from the islands, right? The natives who occupied the islands for generations were forcibly evicted by the Americans and the Brits, and that they now are trying to seek some sort of, compensation for their pain and suffering. Mm-hmm. Well, I had noticed this island the other day because I was looking at sailing routes. I own a sailboat. I'm a sailor, and I was looking at sailing routes across the Indian Ocean, and there was this group of islands, and on the maps that I'm looking at, the navigation maps, it's encircled, and it says, don't go anywhere near these islands. Not even if you're in distress and your ship is broken, because you risk having your ship confiscated, being imprisoned, and also being fined. And why? Well, because the US and the UK have decided that not only are they going to steal these islands, but they're now going to declare that you're not allowed to navigate anywhere near them. And why do I bring this up? Because it is at the heart of the hypocrisy around, for example, what the US screams and yells about in regards to the South China Sea, where China says these are our islands, and the US says you don't have the right to do that because that's not how international navigation rules work. But then what are you guys doing over in the Indian Ocean with the Chagos islands, right? Mm-hmm. You're doing exactly what you're telling China they're doing. And yet China actually has more claim to the islands in the South China Sea than the US has claim to islands in the Indian Ocean, right? It's just one example, but these types of examples of hypocrisy are legend, and there's so many of them. And I think that a lot of people who argue the whole China bad thing, they just don't want to see it. They don't want to see that all these nations can do a bit of bad, and it's all kind of relative.
Yeah, and I guess I don't know. I will say, like, as somebody who has sort of Eastern European background and stuff, I'm not going to get into Russia right now, but um, as somebody who sort of, I suppose, watched people from, my heritage and stuff being painted as the villains for sort of decades and decades, due to the Cold War and such, I guess I'm just very suspicious of, like, the propagandization of, China bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
It happens to whichever nation happens to be convenient to be the bad guy a lot of the time. So I
That's
would
correct.
just, yeah, I
And
would just,
I think, like you said, don't need to get into specifics, but I think that there really is, the US is masterful at propagandizing its citizens and also the world with regards to who is the bad guy. And I find that, Chinese news reporting is very refreshing by comparison, because in general, they try to report on harmonious things. And people will laugh. People will laugh in the comments. Haha, yeah, China media is censored. But, oftentimes I just ask myself, would I rather live in a place where the media is guided by the principle that people should spend their days not worrying about these things and not feeling angst and upset about these things and not driving people to be angry about these things, versus living in a society where people's levels of anxiety and mental illness and depression and drug use and all of these things are astronomical because they're inside of this sort of propaganda matrix where they're constantly being told something, someone, or some nation is out to get them. Be afraid, be afraid, be afraid all the time, right?
yeah.
This was the point of the Bad Day LA game that I made in Hong Kong, which admittedly was not a good game, but the core of the message of that game was meant to lampoon this idea of the American culture driven by fear. And whatever you want to say about China's media and lack of freedom for the media here, the one positive that I like about it, and of course it has negatives. Of course, this is not trying to say it's totally perfect, but one of the positives that I find with it is that it does not operate on this sort of clickbaity, fear-driven algorithm, nor does it seek to brainwash its citizens to hate citizens in other countries. Because the way that the Chinese view it is that all of the countries of the world are potential customers for its mercantile vision of trading, goods and services and products with everybody. So for them to sit down and say, well, let's start demonizing the Americans, to their worldview would be incredibly counterproductive, because it then says, well, the Americans, if we hate them, why would we make them our customers, right?
Mm-hmm.
This kind of thing is, I think, core to the difference in the thinking between the peoples of the two countries. And it's why, like, in the comments of this video, we're going to get people who are yelling at me that I'm a traitor or that I'm a CCP shill or whatever, where when you talk to people here and you say, what do you think about the US? And they're like, I don't.
Right.
Why would I think about the US? Because they don't. They have no reason to think about the US, and they have no idea that people in the US are being brainwashed to hate them. And that's a huge difference.
Yeah. I guess I would always say, I will say for the record, not a Russian supporter, if people are wondering that by what I said earlier. But and obviously I don't support a lot of the things that the Chinese government has done, and, pretty much any government has a lot of things that I wouldn't support. But I suppose
look,
it's just like, be ethically pragmatic, like look at a situation and be able to objectively say one way or the other. There's like, I just don't see any point in being like blindly patriotic, I suppose.
So I agree with you 100% on that. And that's where I think that the people listening to this who are getting ready to write CCP shill in the comments should understand. I'm not a CPC, Chinese Communist Party or Communist Party of China supporter in any sense of the word, any more than I would be a supporter of the U.S. government. In fact, I view myself as a bit of a libertarian, and also just a sort of citizen of the world. I like people, right? I'm not very interested in like cheerleading for any one particular government institution, and I also don't think that like the Chinese government or the Australian government or the Thai government or any of these governments should be held up and been, be like, this one is better than the other one. It's, one of the things we joke about with sailboats. I'm going to go back to sailing stuff. Is that every boat is a collection of compromises. You can have a fast boat, but it's maybe not going to be a comfortable boat. Or you could have a very expensive boat that's got all kinds of comforts on board, but it's not going to be very fast. Or on and on, right? There's these trade-offs. Governments are exactly the same. The Chinese government is really good at certain things. It's super efficient at like, massive infrastructure projects. But maybe it's not as good at sort of the lower level social adjustments to improve people's lives on an individual basis. It's good at the big picture, not good at the individual. Maybe in the US, it's flipped around the other way. Where do you come down on that? I don't know. I don't think there's a perfect government in the world. But I also think that for somebody who sits in China and says, hey, it turns out that China's not this giant organ harvesting, abortion forcing, crazy want to take over the world country, I should be able to say that without people freaking out and saying that I've, sold my soul to the devil. At the same time that they should be able to say, hey, life in the U.S. is not all homeless people and blowing up other people's gas pipelines, right? So I just think it's funny that we as individuals fight amongst ourselves about these government entities to which we really have no control or connection.
It is a little bit like my dad can beat up your dad at the end of the day.
Exactly. It's like rooting for a sports team, and buying the jerseys and stuff, but like the fucking sports team doesn't give a shit about you.
Yeah. You're not on the team.
No.
Well, anyway, hopefully if, that all upset you very much, you managed to skip through it or something, and now we'll sort of get back to talking about games a little bit. But
Sure.
So with just back to Spicy Horse, but with Grim, I suppose that game is like a little bit lighter and maybe a little more like child friendly than people expected after Alice. Although it still sort of tackles like dark topics. Was that intentional to make that game a little bit more accessible, maybe?
Well, yeah, I mean, this goes back to what I was saying to you before about my general desire for making games accessible, and trying to lower the difficulty level, and make them more approachable, for sure.
And in terms of like Alice and Grim, what do you enjoy about reinterpreting old stories?
So the thing I like about old stories, and it could be biblical or it could be fairy tales, but is that they oftentimes contain these hard-earned lessons on the rules of life. It's one of the things I actually, Jordan Peterson has become very controversial, and he says a lot of dumb things these days. But I was aware of his work prior to his becoming famous in the way that he is these days. He'd written a book on sort of character types, and now I've forgotten what the title of it was, but that I found really interesting because it kind of went through the moral lessons that are contained within the literature of religion and fairy tales and things like that. And Joseph Campbell, has also done this in his books. And so when you go and you work with that material, you're kind of retelling the source code of survival for humans, whether it be, don't lie and don't cheat and, don't covet another man's goat or whatever.
Kind of Jungian, I guess, right?
What's that?
Sort of Jungian, right? I think Carl Jung.
Well,
He talked
Hey,
about
but he's another interpreter. He wasn't necessarily a rule maker. So the rules for survival are set out in these ancient fairy tales or in these, religious texts. And there's a reason why certain religions survive to, go on. Like, guess what the fastest growing religious group in China is right now? It's Christians. And there's a reason why, because that is a very party sort of mind virus full of a bunch of rules that really appeal to people when it comes to survival and success in life. So why I like to reinterpret those is because it's sort of core material. It's trying to communicate to people on a level about those rules for survival, the rules for some amount of happiness, that I find really really interesting, and that I think if you can engage people with that stuff, you might help them. They might learn a little bit, as to why lying, for example, can be so damaging, and you might help them to lead a little bit of a better life.
Right, right. Well, yeah, I guess like what I was talking about with Jung is that I think he had this concept about archetypes where I guess he suggested that like a lot of our mental imagery is sourced sort of back from like our ancient selves. Like we have almost these recurring mental images that we apply to things.
Yeah, I mean, there's some guys who talk about this idea that some of this stuff is encoded in our DNA, some of the survival instinct stuff. So, like, one of the things that's quite famous is the idea that, like, kittens or children can recognize and know to fear a snake,
Yeah.
um, when they've never seen one before. And so, yeah, I think that it probably makes sense that some amount of a basic operating system is built into us for survival, and that carries on genetically as we pass that on to our children. Yeah, so I think that when I'm telling these kinds of stories, I'm hopeful that we're sort of tapping into that basic programming, and that it's maybe waking that up for people and making them aware of the importance of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. And with uh Madness Returns, when you started working on that, was there a lot of stuff left over from Alice? Like, were there gameplay elements and environments that maybe you hadn't been able to implement in the first game that you wanted to bring into the second? Or was it sort of you started from scratch?
Well, the distance in time between the production of the two games was so great that you basically have to go back to the drawing board and start over with imagining what's possible, right?
Right.
Just because 10 years went past, and the amount of changes in the technology for scripting cinematic sequences and building levels and lighting things, I mean, it all just changed so radically. So I mean, we sort of started from the position of it's in the same genre, in the same vein, but technologically we need to start from scratch to see what can be accomplished, especially because it's Wonderland. There's a lot of stuff you want to do with surrealism that you couldn't have done previously. But in terms of the narrative, we had already assembled a cast of characters and left enough loose threads from the first story that we knew there would be material in there to go back and pick it up,
Mm-hmm.
um, and start to weave a new narrative.
Um, you've talked in other interviews about sort of your childhood being a bit of a bizarre juxtaposition between like fundamentalist Christian worldviews and then more eccentric like alternative lifestyles. How do you think that sort of split reality influenced your game design philosophy?
Well, I guess it influences everything. I've never really thought about it, how it would influence game design per se, but then I mean, I don't always consider myself a game designer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you ask me, I don't know. I think people who are technical game designers do a lot more spreadsheet work and a lot more sort of cerebral game game puzzle, game designy type of stuff than I'm interested in doing. So ultimately, my role, I think, is more about like a creative director and a writer, and how it's influenced me as a writer is, a huge thing. Again, could probably go on for a whole podcast talking about, the foundations of one's creative output from that sort of background. But I'd say that the things about my childhood that were most painful or most disconcerting also ultimately ended up being the most fertile places in my imagination for, the kinds of stories that I want to tell, or I enjoy telling, or that I maybe am good at telling. And I think that's generally true in life, that we oftentimes look at challenge, or we look at adversity, or we look at pain, traumatic experiences, as something that we want to shy away from, and that have no value, and that should be put as far away from us as possible. I think my childhood and how that went over into my creative process taught me differently. It taught me that those are catalysts, that what we normally consider a negative event of something painful or traumatic, those offer really good sort of opportunities for transformation and for growth, and also for creative output. Because a lot of times that's what I think creative output is. It's the it's the pipe out of which flows all the stuff that you process. But you have to start with something to process. I'm not saying like you have to go through a bad life and have traumatic experiences to be a good writer or whatever, but that's how it came out for me. So I think that answers the question.
Yeah, maybe more about finding ways to utilize the trauma, I guess, in positive ways, than like you need to be traumatized in order to be creative, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm. I guess I will just ask the question, because I'm sure anyone listening wants me to ask the question. In terms of Alice 3, are there any new developments with it versus sort of the last couple of years, or is it basically in the same place?
Well, we just did a huge update a week or two ago, which was the release of the 100% complete design Bible for Alice Asylum. So that is a 414-page epic, graphic presentation of basically like what the game is, except it's in book format, right?
Right.
And that's what our pre-production team has been working on for the last couple of years. So it was a massive undertaking by 6 artists that are funded by our supporters over on Patreon. We shared the development with constant updates as that was getting produced. And now that it's done, we've sent it off to a number of different potential publishers and financiers, alongside the announcement that we found a potential development partner here in Shanghai with a company called Virtuous.
Mm-hmm.
And that we've outlined a very clear vision for what is the game, how much is it going to cost to develop, how long is it going to take to develop, and where and how are we going to develop it, right? So it's sort of the culmination, or the end of the process of everything that we've been doing for pre-production to date. And it takes us into a new phase, which is to go out and to pitch that material, and hopefully find somebody who is willing to fund it, so that we can get it into development. But it's a big ask. We're asking for like $40 million US
Mm-hmm.
to fund a new game. And I honestly don't know if the appetite for that is out there or not. The games industry kind of moves in cycles, and there's periods of time where, narrative driven story games are, everybody wants to make one, and there's times where no one wants to touch them. So I'm not sure what the result of this will be, but I do feel confident that if there's somebody out there who's interested in funding this type of product, they would be hard pressed to find a better presentation for this type of product. So yeah, we're hopeful that it'll get in front of the right eyeballs and someone will pick it up.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that all sounds pretty positive for fans of the series, at least. Definitely some big movements.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing everything we can. At the end of the day, I don't own it. I don't own the rights. EA does, and it's ultimately really up to them to make it where the rights are in a position where something new can get done, and or maybe they would even fund something new. Um, but for my personal role in this, I feel like I'm coming to an end on it because I no longer want to be the person responsible for trying to get it made after I've done this effort. If this gets it done, that's great. It was my goal from the start. If it continues to flounder and can't get made, there's not much else that I personally can do
Yeah.
to make that a reality. And to be honest, like frankly, I get to be a little bit tired of being the torchbearer for the entire franchise when it often opens me up to criticism from people who are like, why are you taking so long to do this?
Right. Yeah.
And I just think like, hey guy, I'm not actually, I don't get paid for doing this, right? It's not what keeps me alive. And so it's somewhat of a passion project, and it's something that I do on behalf of the fans. Um, but I don't want to be the person who is ultimately and solely responsible for this because, like I said, I don't own it. So every day that I spend building more and more content and trying to build up a pitch that proves the value of this IP is another day I spend increasing the value of something that is owned by someone else. And I
Yeah.
have
Right.
no guarantee. I have no guarantee that EA or anyone else will pick this up. I also have no guarantee that even if they do pick it up, they'll involve me in any fashion, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not obligated to. So, yeah, I really hope that by the end of this year, 2023, that it comes to some sort of resolution. Either it's very clear that it's not going to happen, it's never going to happen, or it becomes very clear that someone is going to pick it up and make it happen. And
Mm-hmm.
if it does get picked up and it does go forward, I'll say right here, I think it's the first time I've said this publicly, but I'm not particularly interested in being involved in the development, like the day-to-day development. I do not want to be involved in that. I think there are younger, brighter, and more sort of driven people out there who would be better positioned to do that. Like Alex Crowley, who's been my design partner on this since the start. He would be a great person to run with it. But for me, like I feel like I've said and done all I can do inside that design Bible in terms of my vision for what the new game would be, and I don't necessarily need to be involved
Right. Right.
beyond that in the next one, right? So
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, it's been, something you've been working on for such long periods, and with, such
yeah, I mean,
little happening with it for such long periods, and dealing with so many difficulties, and
yeah.
backseat game designers who've never game designed telling you how it should be done. I'm sure.
Well, the one I love is are the group of people who tell me that I'm operating some sort of a scam, and I don't understand how they think that scam works because any and all money that comes from Patreon just goes to pay the artists. And if it didn't go to pay the artists, then those artists would complain or we wouldn't have artists, right?
Yeah.
And then the other one is that somehow the fact that we've built a successful plush company at the same time that this Alice work has been going on is linked into the scam. And again, I think like, but that's an online retail business. Like if we made a plush, one of the things I read is like we're using Patreon money to make plush toys, and I think, are you sure you've done the math on that? Because we're using the customers' money that they put into the website to purchase the thing to make the plush toy,
Yeah.
and if we didn't do that and we didn't deliver the product, then again we'd have people complaining about a whole different issue. So I don't know. It's the complaints we get on this stuff are sometimes very silly.
Mm-hmm. I know, yeah, your throat is very sore, but I did want to talk very quickly about the plushes because they are quite interesting to me. Could you just, very quickly sort of talk about how that initial concept came about?
Yeah, well, we did a plush as a reward for our patrons that was the distressed rabbit, inspired by the little rabbit that you see Alice holding at the beginning of the first Alice game. For legal and technical reasons, I need to tell you that it's not that rabbit, but it is inspired by
Right.
that rabbit.
Okay.
So we did that inspired by rabbit, and then we put it in the Mysterious Shop, which I had already had the Mysterious Shop running since 2015. Since we had closed down Spicy Horse, my then partner, now wife, she and I had been doing a variety of fashion items. She's a fashion designer, right? So she comes out of that world. And so we did a couple of things that are sort of fashion, jewelry, purses and bags and stuff like that. And that was doing quite well. I mean, it was paying the bills and, nothing to complain about. But the rabbit really started to sell like crazy. And then people started asking us to make other rabbits and other designs. And early on, I decided that based on my experience with making games and this sort of like issue of too many chefs in the kitchen and designers fighting with each other about which direction to go, I came up with this notion that we were going to do everything based on customer feedback via this thing called crowd design. And so we did that. We started saying, look, we don't design these toys, you do. Here's an initial sketch, now give us your feedback and we'll drive that feedback towards a final product. And people love that, right? It really drives their engagement towards the thing from day one. And then, of course, we started getting more and more requests. Well, can you do a rabbit based on this theme or that theme? And the more of those requests we answered, the more engagement we got and the more rabbits we're selling, to the point now where 2022, last year, was my most successful year in terms of financial success of my entire life. And purely driven by the success of this plush brand that we built. And so it's been an incredible story. We've had a lot of fun with it, and it's a really small team. It's myself and my wife, and we have one designer artist, Jennifer, and we have a guy, Martin, here in Shanghai who does customer support. And we have a few artists that we hire with proceeds from the sales of the rabbits, a lot of times from marginalized groups. And then that's it. It's a really tight little small company, and we have a lot of fun interacting with our customers, and we're tackling a lot of really interesting design themes that I think a lot of people previously haven't thought to tackle or have been afraid to tackle.
Yeah, well, I mean, what interested me about them was sort of the mental health angle of them, where you have sort of like an anxiety rabbit, and mental health is sort of a key element of the design features of them. And I think that like it's important for people with mental health issues to see other people with them and to see it represented and to see that it exists and it's okay that it exists. But I have seen that there's been like some adversity towards it, which is odd to me. But why do you think that is, that people are adverse to these representations of mental health?
Well, first of all, what you said is exactly right. We should be making these difficult topics more visible. We should be making it where people are more comfortable to talk about those things and to admit to themselves and to others that they may be struggling with something. And this goes back to what you and I were talking about earlier, that I believe that oftentimes difficulties are powerful catalysts for change. But in order for that catalyst to function, the first thing you have to do is recognize and embrace the problem. So if you have anxiety, for example, a lot of people will tell themselves that, they don't have anxiety, or that anxiety is something for someone else. Anxiety is not something I'm dealing with, right? And I think it's kind of funny, this notion of embracing these issues, but with our rabbits, it's sort of like, well, snuggle them too, hold them close and snuggle them. But it is, to me, I think, important to have something like a totem, something that you can hold on to that represents this issue that you're struggling with. And I think that a lot of people, when they've come to criticize us, once they realize what it is we're trying to do, they turn their criticism around, because the goal here, first of all, is that people are making requests of us to make these things because they want to feel seen, right? They want to have visibility. And if you go and you read the comments of the people who reply to the new designs that we put up, and they're shocked, they're like, "Oh my God, I never thought anybody would do anything in relation to this, this mental or physical issue that I'm struggling with." And so to be seen and to be recognized to them is incredibly powerful. And then you see
Mm-hmm.
that they're forming little communities around these individual designs. But the other thing that we're finding is there's a lot of people who pop up in the comments and say, "I didn't realize this was a thing, and I've struggled with this forever. And to now know that I'm not alone, and that I've got a community, and that the thing I'm dealing with has a name, and that maybe I can go to see a specialist about this." That happens all the time now, all the time,
Wow.
where people are like, "Oh my God, my thing I thought was just me isn't just me."
Yeah, right.
So, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that's going on around this, and I feel really proud of it. It's the same reason I feel proud of the Alice games. People play those games and they recognize a lot of their own traumas and their own issues in there, and then they feel like they're a part of something larger. They're not alone, and they
Mm-hmm.
feel like they can get something cathartic out of that. They can get that transformation process out of playing that game, or in this case now, out of joining this community and snuggling these bunnies that represent these issues.
Yeah, I also think, like, I talked about a little bit with the Alice game, but I think there's something powerful about making psychological problems tangible and physical and real and visible, because I think you do a lot of telling yourself it's not real, it's just a thought or it's just a feeling or whatever, and you're pushed into, like, I guess, trying to hide this thing rather than letting it occur and then, like, dealing with it, which I think, like,
So,
yeah.
so there's a book I just finished listening to. It's called The Myth of Normal, and I highly recommend it on this topic. And he talks about this, that a lot of the diseases that we see in the world, whether they be cancers or inflammatory diseases, and they oftentimes come from the suppression of emotion or the suppression of trauma. And when you look at it, it's exactly what you just said, of people trying to say it's not real or I don't want to deal with it. But the longer you go on doing that, the sicker your mind body kind of system becomes, because not recognizing that something is out of balance and not addressing it makes people sick. And I think a lot of people think, "Oh, well, I just take a pill and it goes away." But if it's, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, if it's a memory of a trauma, or if it's a trauma that occurred to you as a child or something, and you've repressed it and you've shoved it down for so long, it can be manifesting itself inside of your physical body, 20, 30 years later, and you don't even know why you suddenly have this malady, whatever illness or whatever it is. So again, like you said, having a physical thing that you hold on to represent that, and to say to yourself, "Yeah, this problem I have is real." But the best thing about saying a problem is real is that once it's real, once you recognize it as real, you can address it. You can start to work with it. So I'm hopeful that when people see these designs that we're doing, they recognize that that's one of the larger goals that exists within this, is for people to be able to hold these up and say, "This is my problem. This is the problem I have." It doesn't have to be a forever problem either. I see people saying like, "Oh, you're selling, some sort of identity, and people are just adopting these identities." No, I mean, maybe there's some people where that's happening, but I think a lot of people, um, and it depends on the situation, but there's a lot of people who want to embrace this, and then they don't want to be a victim of the thing. They want to be, it's integrated, or they're a survivor of it as opposed to being a victim of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I almost feel like it wouldn't happen if it was, like, physical illnesses as well. There's still a bit of weirdness in terms of accepting that mental illness is even a real thing, for a lot of people, I feel like.
Sure.
Um, well, this may be a difficult one to answer. This is the question I put to all of my guests, since they're usually doom-centric. But you may not even be able to come up with an answer for this. What would be your favorite Doom monster from the roster, and why?
Um, you know, I I mean, I remember all the Doom monsters. I think from just a kind of memory perspective, just the classic brown imps, little guys that throw the fireballs. I just always liked them because of the kind of sound effect that they made at a distance when they were walking around. It was that kind of pig chortle sound,
Yeah.
and it always was quite scary to me. But that plus just the fact they threw a fireball, and I thought their death animations and stuff like that were always pretty good. And you could slaughter lots of them at once. I always liked them. I was never that big a fan of sort of the zombified space marine stuff. I always liked the more demonic
Mhm.
creatures. But I was always a big fan of cannon fodder. I just thought it was fun being able to mow lots of things down as opposed to having some tanky kind of creature that took a lot of damage and was on screen for a long time. So yeah, I can answer that question. I'd say it was just the standard imp.
That's a good answer. Underrepresented in these answers, but a good one.
Oh,
Well, yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. Sorry for keeping you with your sore throat, but I'm so happy you managed to soldier through. Because it was a really interesting interview. I'm sure there will be, as you said, a lot of comments below this one, but we will take them in stride. And yeah, thanks a lot.
sure, no problem. And thank you so much for having me on. And with that, I'm going to go to gargle some throat medicine of some sort.
Well, good luck with that. I hope you have a swift recovery.
Thanks so much.
And to everyone listening, I'll be back with another guest next week. So thank you to you as well, and goodbye. Well, Picksdrift has subscribed to the highest level on Patreon. They are now a Doom God. So I'm giving them a spicy shout out at the end of the podcast, as promised. If you would like your own shout out, you're gonna have to match Picksdrift's incredible generosity. So that's really on you. But yeah, thank you to all my patrons, but mostly and really only Picksdrift. But yeah, thank you to everyone.